demonstration and leave the square has come and gone without incident. President Bush today urged restraint by Chinese authorities, saying they should go as far as possible with democratic reforms. Mr. Bush advised Chinese demonstrators to speak out for their beliefs, but to do so without violence. We'll keep you up to date on the situation in China throughout the evening as events warrant. That's our report for tonight. Tom Jarrell will have more news later on the Weekend Report. I'm Sam Donaldson. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
From Washington, this is...
I'm Ward Lucas. Thanks for joining us. Here's what's happening. There are incredible scenes coming out of Beijing, China this weekend. The Chinese government is continuing to face the overwhelming embarrassment of its citizens rising up en masse against the communist leadership. The demonstration began a week ago with 50 to 100,000 students staging a nonviolent protest against the government. Today, more than 1 million other Chinese have joined the students to demand democracy from the government. The protest isn't just being staged in the capital, Beijing. It's spread to a dozen other Chinese cities as well. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens continue to march up and down the streets of Beijing. The crowds are so massive, the Chinese government just doesn't have a solution, a way to get the demonstrators to return home. Army troops are gathered in various places around the capital, but there's much doubt about whether they'll take action if ordered to do so. In fact, there are even reports some soldiers have actually turned back to avoid a conflict with their countrymen. The students have vowed to remain nonviolent if they're attacked by the troops. There is some question about whether the 1 million or so supporters of the students in Beijing right now will also remain nonviolent if that happens. There are rumors the Chinese government is preparing a major announcement. So far, no word on what that announcement might be. Many Chinese students here in Colorado say they're excited and yet worried about what's happening at home. They're pleased so many of their countrymen have come out to support the student protest, but they're also afraid the whole thing is going to end in violence. Despite their physical separation from China, they say they feel a closeness to their country right now. Today, about 150 Chinese citizens held their own protest in Boulder. Kim Christensen was there.
A proud and united Chinese community marched down the Pearl Street Mall. Students from at least 4 colleges in Colorado and their families, including many children too young to understand what's happening in their homeland. Much of their chanting was in Chinese, but their protest signs in plain English. They say this march symbolizes the end of their oppression, and that's important to them.
Very important for me, actually, because I got to do something to support Chinese students and democracy.
I've been in Beijing. I'm very glad to see this.
They pick up support from people on the mall who are glad to see their vocal demonstration.
Now that they have a chance, an opportunity, they're breathing out, they're ventilating. And you see this all over the country.
They're sending a letter to their government asking the communist leaders to meet with the protesting students and to end martial law.
This is the only safe solution for our nation and our country at this critical moment.
Many people here believe this grassroots revolt against the Chinese government is really just the beginning. They believe that it may signal the end to communism worldwide.
It's a movement worldwide to not accept the status quo anymore and to move into freedom. Many students, thousands, are studying in the United States and the free world, and they're getting educated, they're tasting freedom.
It's that taste of freedom these students want to share with their entire country. They say reform is the only way China can survive because its people are politically starving without it. Kim Christensen, 9 News.
An estimated 40,000 Chinese students study here in the United States. Many political experts believe those students have had a great deal of impact on the students over in China, encouraging them to revolt and demand democracy.
There are reports.
And Colorado. Now from the McGraw-Hill Communications Center, this is KMGH 7 News.
Students in China have defied another ultimatum to end their pro-democracy uprising. Good evening, I'm Lynn Setzer.
And I'm David Crabtree. The protesters say Chinese Premier Li Peng ordered them out of Tiananmen Square by dawn Monday or face military attack. But it's already Monday afternoon in Beijing, and about 200,000 students and supporters still occupy the square, which has been the center of the 5-week-long pro-democracy movement. While there are no troops near the square, hundreds of military trucks are waiting in Beijing's suburbs. Soldiers have reportedly sealed off the city and have occupied major state-run media. Under martial law, Western journalists are forbidden to take pictures of the events, but CBS got this video out of Beijing on a flight to Tokyo. In his first detailed comments on the situation in China, President Bush today called on Chinese authorities to show restraint in dealing with the demonstrators, saying he does not want a peaceful protest to end in bloodshed.
More than 200 Chinese students and other transplanted Chinese marched in Boulder today to show solidarity with demonstrating citizens in their homeland. Caroline Schomp has the story.
They shouted their support in both Chinese and English as they marched up and down the Boulder Mall several times.
We say, long live Chinese people.
What else?
Long live freedom.
What else?
And long live democracy.
There was lots of support from the people enjoying Sunday on the mall.
I've been in Beijing. I'm very glad to see this. I'm very glad to see it.
People eating lunch paused to cheer and applaud. They accepted the position paper handed to them.
The government should accept the reasonable request from the students and open a dialogue with the student representatives selected by themselves.
The Chinese national anthem was led by Hao Chan, an opera singer who now lives in Denver. The talk was about what's going on at home.
You know, without political reform, the economic reform is eventually going to be, to be stopped.
CU Professor Jeff Bennett was in China just 2 weeks ago.
I marched along the route that the students were going on, just parallel to them. And they had troops out and police out at several different places along the way to try and stop them. And each time they would stop for about half an hour, and then all of a sudden the police would get out of the way and let them go through.
The news blackout imposed by the government angers them, and they gathered around to listen to one woman who would talk to her family in Beijing today. Many of these people have family members either close to the main square in Beijing or actually participating in the demonstrations.
I'm very concerned about the safety of my own brother, and we couldn't hear from him, and I get no news from him.
And if you were in Peking, would you be in the square too?
Definitely, I'll be in the square.
In Boulder, Caroline Schomp, KMGH 7 News.
A head-on collision between two miniature passenger trains at Royal Gorge.
Marty Caniglio and Les Shapiro.
Good evening. Here's what's happening at 10 o'clock. The deadline has come and gone in Beijing. The Chinese government ordered protesting students to leave Tiananmen Square by 5 a.m. Monday. It's now 1 in the afternoon Monday in Beijing, and students continue to defy martial law. More than 200,000 students say they will not give up until democracy is declared in the communist country. Chinese officials say nearly 1,500 troops are armed and ready to take action against the protesters. So far, though, no military movement. Sources say it's because Chinese officials are at odds over just what to do.
Demonstrations aren't limited to Beijing. Protesters are marching in streets all over the world. About 5,000 people demonstrated outside the Chinese embassy in London today. Protesters called for the resignation of Premier Li Peng. And a similar protest in Dallas. About 150 people carried signs and chanted freedom outside City Hall. Demonstrators denounced the Chinese government and the threat to use force in Beijing.
In Boulder as well, Chinese demonstrators took to the streets in a show of support for the protesters in Beijing. Brian Moss reports their lifeline for the latest information from China is now a computer network manned by students around the world.
The cry for democratic reform in China echoed through Boulder this afternoon. 100 Chinese students and teachers living in Colorado rallied in support of their countrymen. It is a wrenching experience for these students, so distant from a situation that for them is of such immediate and profound importance. With so many friends and relatives in Beijing, these Chinese students are anxious for information, but they say the fast pace of events has made newspapers obsolete, and radio and television reports are only intermittent. So they are relying on a special computer network that allows Chinese students to communicate worldwide. CU student Xiaodong Zhang is hooked in with thousands of other Chinese students in the U.S. and overseas. For Xiaodong and the other concerned Chinese students, this is the only way of getting timely, uncensored information.
As soon as we get news, we type on the computer and post it immediately. So after about 1 minute, the news will broadcast all over the world.
The students say they feel powerless being so far removed from the upheaval in China, but the computer network is helping narrow the gap. In Boulder, Brian Moss, News 4.
President Bush made his first public statement today about the demonstrations in China. Speaking
now, as tens of thousands of students and their supporters continue to defy martial law and demonstrate in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Premier Li Peng's power seems to have eroded further today when 100 top military officers announced they will not move against the protesters. And Glasnost takes a glamorous turn in the Soviet Union, which held its first ever nationwide beauty pageant yesterday. Welcome to the International Hour. I'm David French in Washington, and we'll have more on that. But first, Ralph Wenge is in Atlanta with our top story.
At least 40 people are reported injured in that first major clash between Chinese troops and pro-democracy demonstrators. The skirmish occurred just several hours ago in a suburb southwest of Beijing. Soldiers from an army convoy reportedly left their vehicles and attacked civilians with sticks and bricks taken from a construction site. With us now for a phone update from Beijing is CNN's Brian Jenkins. Brian, are you seeing anything different over there now?
No, as a matter of fact, it's quite quiet here at this point. It is now 4 in the morning. The mood of the tens of thousands of students still camped out at Tiananmen Square at the heart of Beijing can best be described as subdued. The sense of fear and anticipation that gripped the crowd at the square last night seems to be missing tonight. The deadline set by the government of 5 a.m. Monday for the students to leave the square or to be cleared out by military forces passed 23 hours ago now. The students seem less fearful that the military will try to move into the city. The reports of that clash in the suburb between citizens and soldiers has reached the square, but possible reports of troops trying to move into this part of the city do not seem to have been proven to be true. No such word has reached the square. And now students in formation on bicycles are parading slowly up and down the avenue which runs past the square, chanting slogans, seeming quite relaxed and confident at this point about their chances of surviving this 10-day sit-in without a violent confrontation. Ralph?
Brian, they've been out there a long time. Is there any sign that the students and other demonstrators are just getting to the point of being so fatigued they may at one point just decide to turn it all in?
I think they would like to at this point. Student leaders have indicated that they would end their protest and go back to their schools if they could sit down and talk with the government. The problem is no one seems to be in charge, firmly in charge of the government at this point. And for the students to leave now would be a loss of face for them. So they are in a position of having to wait until the government indicates who is in charge and who can sit down, if anyone, and talk with them.
Brian, just one more thing here. There is a total news blackout. So as far as the students learning any information about martial law, about any possible soldiers moving into the area, is the only information they're getting through the bullhorns?
Well, they seem to have an extensive grapevine reaching out into the city and even into the provinces, into other cities where demonstrations are going on. There are bands of motorcyclists who roam about the city gathering information and bringing it back to the square. But I must say that CCTV, the state-run television network, did broadcast a good deal of information showing pictures and videotape of what was happening all around the city and in other Chinese cities. We showed that on CNN about 6 hours ago now, and I was quite astounded at the extent of their coverage, the aspects that they were showing of what was going on here. And I think it indicates that journalists here are taking advantage of a vacuum in the power structure and exercising their freedom of the press and informing the citizens of what is actually happening. Whether there is a crackdown on the media soon, we'll have to see.
Okay, Brian, thank you very much. CNN's Brian Jenkins on the phone with us from Beijing. Now, many millions of people in China know less about the challenge to their government than the rest of the world does. Despite the imposition of martial law in Beijing, the Chinese media are trying to downplay the story. For example, on the evening news last night, Chinese viewers were shown scenes of downtown Beijing that emphasized a return to order.
记者在现场看到，整个天安门广场比较平静。一些大学生配合环卫工人清理天安门广场和街上的垃圾，增加消毒药水，防止传染病流行。曾经夜以继日的紧张抢救绝食学生的医务工作者们，也终于可以轻松的休息一下了。他们中间
Medical workers who have been keeping a close watch on hunger strikers now feel quite relaxed.
在北京最繁华的商业区王府井大街，
In Wangfujing, which is the busiest shopping center in Beijing,
连日来，北京市各商店没有发生一起打砸抢烧事件，
the shops have been working normally,
仍然可以照常上街购物。
and the people can still do shopping.
执行戒严任务的部分人民解放军部队，今天仍被阻在北京城郊附近，因路程尚未清除。
Who are carrying the martial law are still blocked away in the suburb of Beijing.
这是本台记者报道的。
This is reported by CCTV.
本台记者外出采访看到，在西长安街一段交通秩序良好，行人和自行车各行其
At the
道，
Chang'an Street,
没有发现堵车现
the
象。
traffic is going on very
正
smoothly.
常速度行驶。据记者观察，北京部分路段公共交通已经恢复。
Now the public transportation has resumed to normal.
开始，北京的15路等共61条路线的公共汽车已恢复运营，市民们在有秩序地排队等车。
I feel that workers should go back to work. And we are able to put the stability. Now we Chinese can understand each other. As far as I see it, that everything here in Beijing is going on very well.
Well, despite the rather tranquil nature of that report, another broadcast aired last evening said severe disorders still threaten Beijing.
Barricades are up around the city, keeping troops from reaching the majority of student demonstrators. Barricades of every conceivable description, as CNN's Charlie Hoff reports.
A city in revolution, Beijing, China. Buses block the streets, their tires flat. They keep the approaching Chinese army away from the core of the movement, the masses in Tiananmen Square. The people in this Chinese capital control the streets. Dozens of troop trucks were stalled behind this blockade west of the city. Among the thousands of citizens, anarchy ruled. It is the young people who assume control. In this case, the people were reluctant to let us take pictures of the troops.
We have agreement with the soldiers that they do not want to appear in foreign screen, you see, or foreign TV. They don't want to.
We were able to mingle with the troops and the people after some lengthy negotiations. It is an atmosphere of peaceful coexistence. The armed soldiers at this site generally shied from the camera, but a lack of military discipline was plain. One of the city's major highways is blocked by buses and people. The people outnumber the troops. The citizens treat the soldiers as they would treat themselves. Food and drink are offered to the soldiers. The soldiers are embarrassed. The reality of mixed feelings permeates the streets. A large contingent of armored vehicles sits on a side street in the suburbs of Beijing. The people tell us that there are 68 armored personnel carriers in this line. They say that as many as 500 such tracked war machines are in the vicinity, transported by the nearby railroad. Here, among the typical Chinese apartment buildings, the troops are not so obviously mingling with the population. This may be the most excitement seen in this neighborhood for many years. It is a happening, an event, a draw, something for the whole family to take part in.
China may have the world's largest army, but it also has the world's largest population. And no matter where you go, it seems the population outnumbers the army. Charles Hoff, CNN, Beijing.
And when the International Hour continues, a look at the power struggle in communist China, a land in turmoil because of that massive student drive for democracy. The country in the world appears to be in the hands of a very few people.
At 84 years of age, Deng Xiaoping is China's most powerful leader. Although he holds only one political post, that of chairman of the Central Military Commission, Mr. Deng holds nearly absolute power over the Communist Party and the government. He engineered China's economic revolution and opened the country to the outside world after the chaotic cultural revolution of the 60s and 70s. He helped transform a country dominated by ideological battles into one with pragmatic, market-oriented economic policies. But in recent weeks, Deng's authority has deteriorated. It's widely believed he made the decision to invoke martial law and to call the army in to crack down on the protesters in Beijing. The students are demanding his resignation. Deng hasn't been seen or heard in public since meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in Beijing last week. Some observers believe Deng Xiaoping's frontman is Premier Li Peng. Others say Li Peng wants Deng's job. Either way, at least for now, Li is one of the most powerful men in China and one of the most hated. He is the man who on Saturday actually declared martial law for parts of Beijing. It is his order some military commanders have chosen to defy. The 60-year-old technocrat, trained as an electrical engineer in the Soviet Union, supports economic reforms for China, but prefers a cautious pace. In September, after the inflation rate soared above 30%, Li called for a 2-year economic slowdown. He succeeded the current Communist Party chief, Zhao Ziyang, as premier. Zhao, known for his Western suits and a solid record of economic accomplishment, is suddenly becoming a man of the people. In recent weeks, he's emerged as the hero of students and workers. His reported refusal to go along with the government crackdown placed him in direct opposition to Deng and Li. On Friday, he offered to resign as head of the world's largest communist party rather than endorse the crackdown. But today there are reports he is back at work. The 69-year-old moderate, who supports a more rapid liberalization of China's economic policies, is now believed to be fighting to regain his authority. Another key figure in China's political battle is Wan Li, the head of the National People's Congress. If the Congress is used to challenge Li, Wan could play a crucial role. He is currently visiting the United States. And 81-year-old President Yang Shangkun holds a largely ceremonial post. But he is known to have influence because of his close ties with Deng and his seat on the 17-member party Politburo.
Now, someone who understands the power struggle well is David Aaron, a former Deputy National Security Advisor who spent time in China during the Carter years. He'll be joining us in just a moment on the International Hour.
A brief clash between soldiers and demonstrators several miles from Beijing's Tiananmen Square today. But the clash was only minor, and for the third straight day, the Chinese army failed to enforce martial law in the streets. More than 100 top military officers have signed a letter saying they won't send their troops into the city to confront or suppress the demonstrators. It's now a little after 9 o'clock in the morning in Beijing. We have CNN's Brian Jenkins on the line with the latest on this story. Brian.
Lou, we are now into morning number 11 of the student sit-in on Tiananmen Square, and the tens of thousands of students camped out there are working out the kinks after perhaps the first fairly decent night of sleep they've had since last week. They are doing exercises and washing up and having breakfast. Supplies of food and beverages keep coming in from donors around the city. Shops near the square are reported to be giving students discounts on the supplies they need. And despite a threat from city officials yesterday that water lines to the square would be shut off, they have not been shut off. and the students are able to splash a little water on their faces and refresh themselves. It seems the students would, at this point, like to pack up and go home, go back to their schools after sleeping for 10 nights on concrete and on makeshift cots. But they say they won't leave the square until they have an opportunity to sit down and talk with government officials about their grievances about the lack of freedom of expression, freedom of press, corruption of the bureaucrats and officials, economic reforms that they feel need to be made, and especially the political reforms they need to be made. The question now is whether anyone is firmly in control of the government or the military, if anyone is able to speak for the government in talking with the students. Lou?
What about this letter from the generals, Brian? What can you tell us about that?
Well, apparently it was written by 7 former military commanders who said that as old soldiers they had several demands and they had several positions, and basically they said they would not order their troops to attack their own people. The Chinese troops don't seem to have the stomach for taking the blood of their fellow Chinese, and it indicates that those high-ranking officials of the Communist Party who seemed in the past to control the military may have lost that control. Exactly who is giving the orders at this point, we simply don't know.
What do we know of the political struggle? We were getting reports today that Zhao Ziyang was back at work.
Yes, there were those reports. They have not been confirmed. It seems clear that the political structure is splitting into 2 camps. One camp which supports Zhao, who wanted a conciliatory approach toward the students. He is known as a reformist, both on the economic and political fronts. And of course, the other camp falling in behind Li Peng, the Chinese premier, who issued the declaration of martial law on Saturday. The important figure, perhaps, in all of this is China's senior leader, Deng Xiaoping, who apparently threw his support to Li last week, but who may be reconsidering that at this point. The signs in the Chinese media are mixed about who exactly is in charge. The tone of the articles in the newspapers, in the official newspapers, and the reports on the official television and radio stations seem to indicate a more conciliatory approach toward the students, a more complimentary tone in talking about the student demonstrations. And that may indicate that the followers of Zhao Ziyang have regained some stature, but it's difficult to draw a firm conclusion at this point.
All right, Brian Jenkins in Beijing as we continue following this China story. Rick?
The situation in Beijing. Be here to learn more about how to make business productive. And our cover story tonight examines how Colorado business leaders will help out. Channel 2's Greg Luff reports the Chinese will study management at the University of Denver. At the same time, they learn how Colorado businesses work.
First group's coming in between the first, second, and 3rd of June. And they're going to be from the Expert Bureau, People's Bank of China.
Bob Vinci has a vision, and in the next several weeks, that vision will have a lot to do with these Chinese businessmen. They're some of the most influential business leaders in the People's Republic of China, and they're coming to Denver for an education in American business management. They want to help in moving the Chinese economy forward, and they're counting on the University of Denver, as well as Colorado businesses, to keep them on the right track.
What we sold was the fact that this is integrated. This is classroom integrated with practice. The fact that they're going to be able to come away with deals.
Vinci and others hope that as the Chinese get to know Colorado and learn more about the way we do business, they'll want to become more involved with us.
The initial stage of any business opportunity in China begins with the contact and getting to know the people that are in charge, and we are bringing the...
Staffers at DU's Center for Management Development are drumming up support for the program. More than 250 Chinese and some Taiwanese will come in during the summer, and the unrest in China right now is not expected to interfere.
As far as I know, no matter who is going to win now, they want to push them the production forward.
The Chinese agenda is to do as much as possible, as quick as possible, and when all the paperwork here is taken care of, all the calls are made, it may just be the start of something much bigger.
We could end up with as many as 1,000 students throughout the year attending courses at the University of Denver. And because of that, we could have many more opportunities for our businesses.
Perhaps the key word is discovering of the potential, because I think that we're going to discover a great deal about China.
Already, many local companies like Denver Interplaza have pledged support. Interplaza will provide facilities and transportation, while other companies will host workshops and symposiums for the management program.
It'll be about one more week before the Chinese delegation arrives here in Denver, and then about another 3 more months before they're gone again. In the meantime, Denver business leaders hope to make a significant impression, thinking that somewhere down the line, this visit might make a big difference when it comes to establishing an international business center right here in Denver. Greg Luft, Channel 2 News cover story.
Organizers of the Chinese management workshops, by the way, say there is still time for Colorado businesses that might want to get involved. If you'd like to lend a hand or get involved, you can call the Center for Management Development. That's at the University of Denver.
Damp night after a drenching downpour yesterday afternoon, and the students must be cold, weary, and stiff. But their spirits were lifted a bit last evening as one of the few sour notes during their long protest was drowned out in another display of patriotic fervor. As a work crew raised a fresh portrait of Chairman Mao into place at the gate of heavenly peace, the crowd watching cheered, not so much for the man who ruled China for nearly 3 decades, but for the restoration of harmony at Tiananmen Square. Hours earlier, the students who've held the square for 11 days were horrified to see someone had tossed ink on the portrait of Mao. They feared the incident would mar the positive, peaceful image of their protest they had managed to maintain. But the vandals were quickly captured and led away. Students and journalists and workers then picked up their parading where they'd left off, refusing to run for cover as a spring storm suddenly blew over Beijing. The rain came down in sheets, and after days on end of heat and dust, some students couldn't get enough of the cooling showers. The sleeping bags and cots on the square were quickly soaked, but after sunset, fresh blankets and coats were brought in, and the students had only to show their campus IDs to receive their quota of supplies. They were laying in enough food to last several days, though no one is certain how long the sit-in will go on. But while the students still seem well organized, the government is in disarray. The surprisingly candid reports on state-run Chinese television over the past 2 days suggests that moderates in the Communist Party are coming out on top in a fierce power struggle, and that Chinese Premier Li Peng, who issued the declaration of martial law last Saturday, may be forced out. The only thing which seems certain at this point, though, is that Chinese soldiers have no intention of following orders from anyone to open fire or use force of any kind against the students at Tiananmen Square.
Lou, one sign that control of the government may have shifted back to moderate reform-minded leaders is that I have been addressing you via satellite, not merely over the telephone. It was apparently the Chinese Foreign Ministry which gave the go-ahead about 12 hours ago for foreign television networks to again use the satellite transmission facilities here at CCTV. Authorities pulled the plug on our satellite feed Saturday about an hour after the martial law declared by Chinese Premier Li Peng became official. Of course, Army troops have not moved on Tiananmen Square, and they may now have pulled out of Beijing altogether after military commanders made it clear they would not pass on orders to shoot civilians. And the ban on reports to the outside world has effectively been lifted, so perhaps Li Peng, the premier, has lost control. Eventually, someone will have to fill that power vacuum. Lou?
And Brian, who might that be?
I think there are 2 figures we can look to as possible candidates. One is Juan Lee, the chairman of the National People's Congress, who has been visiting President Bush in Washington. He has cut short his trip to North America and will be returning to China. He may be calling a special session of the People's Congress. There has been a petition drive underway, reportedly, to get a session called to discuss whether the imposition of martial law by the premier was constitutional without the approval of the parliament. Another figure certainly we have to consider is Zhao Ziyang, the Secretary General of the Communist Party of China, who effectively announced his resignation last week, although there has been no official confirmation that his resignation was accepted. He wanted to take a more conciliatory approach toward the student protest movement. He had broken with Deng Xiaoping, China's senior leader, had apparently lost his influence within the top ranks of the party, but may now be staging some sort of a comeback. His whereabouts are unknown to us at this point, but he is a likely figure to emerge out of this power struggle with control.
What about the students, Brian? We understand they're consolidating into a new committee with plans to meet with a new leadership in the Chinese government?
The students seem to have maintained a good deal of control over their protests. They are well disciplined, and they seem much more organized at this point than the government itself. I think they are prepared to sit down with representatives of the government. The problem is no one seems to be coming forward to say, I or we control the government.
And all the indications are that the conservative hardliners in the Chinese leadership led...
As we continue covering the China story, we'll take a break.
What you're about to see.
Following surgery.
Employment rose a fraction of a percentage point last month.
Premier Li Peng to step down amid growing signs that the hardline Chinese leader may be losing a political power struggle.
This is CNN Prime News with Lou Waters at the CNN Center in Atlanta and Rick Moore substituting for Bernard Shaw.
It is Wednesday morning in Beijing. Pro-democracy demonstrators occupying Tiananmen Square are beginning a fifth day in defiance of martial law. They are weary, but they continue to march, claiming they are closer to victory. The students believe there is mass confusion among China's top leadership. Officials embroiled in a power struggle reportedly held talks behind closed doors today, while more troops withdrew from positions on the outskirts of Beijing. In a surprise move, the Chinese government today lifted a 4-day ban on American television broadcasts from Beijing. CNN's Brian Jenkins has our report.
As a work crew raised a fresh portrait of Chairman Mao into place at the gate of heavenly peace, the crowd watching cheered, not so much for the man who ruled China for nearly 3 decades, but for the restoration of harmony at Tiananmen Square. Hours earlier, the students who've held the square for 11 days were horrified to see someone had tossed ink on the portrait of Mao. They feared the incident would mar the positive, peaceful image of their protest they had managed to maintain. But the vandals were quickly captured and led away. Students and journalists and workers then picked up their parading where they'd left off, refusing to run for cover as a spring storm suddenly blew over Beijing. The rain came down in sheets, and after days on end of heat and dust, some students couldn't get enough of the cooling showers. The sleeping bags and cots on the square were quickly soaked, but after sunset, fresh blankets and coats were brought in, and the students had only to show their campus IDs to receive their quota of supplies. They were laying in enough food to last several days, though no one is certain how long the sit-in will go on.
Some students have hinted that they're ready to pull up stakes on their shanty town and go back to their campuses, but leaders of the protest say they want to first sit down and talk with representatives of the government.
But while the students still seem well organized, the government is in disarray. The surprisingly candid reports on state-run Chinese television over the past 2 days suggest that moderates in the Communist Party are coming out on top in a fierce power struggle, and that Chinese Premier Li Peng, who issued the declaration of martial law last Saturday, may be forced out. The only thing which seems certain at this point, though, is that Chinese soldiers have no intention of following orders from anyone to open fire or use force of any kind against the students at Tiananmen Square. Brian Jenkins, CNN, Beijing.
A top Chinese official is flying to Beijing from Washington. Wan Li, the head of the Chinese People's Congress, cut short his U.S. visit today. The Chinese embassy says Wan left for health reasons, but it is believed he is rushing home to deal with China's growing political crisis. Before leaving the U.S., Wan met with President Bush As CNN's John Holloman reports, the White House believes Yuan is likely to take part in a major shakeup among China's top leaders.
President Bush told Chinese People's Congress leader Wan Li the United States wants the Chinese government to continue restraint in dealing with the uprising. In an hour-long meeting, Mr. Bush urged China to stop jamming the voice of America and to give reporters open access. Wan Li cut short his visit to Washington to return to Beijing. U.S. officials believe he could play a crucial role in the crisis that has triggered a power struggle within the leadership there. The officials say Wan Li is likely to convene the People's Congress and urge that it reject the use of military force against the demonstrators. They say he may also encourage the legislature to oust Chinese Premier Li Peng, a hardliner who has unsuccessfully sought to crack down on the mass demonstrations. In the confusion, China has shut down diplomatic communication with the outside world, and Wan Li is now the sole messenger between the president and Chinese leaders. The president told Wan Li he's personally committed to expanding relations with the world's most populous nation as long as China avoids a crackdown on the student demonstrators and implementation of economic and political reforms. Secretary of State James Baker says the uprising is a sign that democratic ideals have taken hold among China's 1 billion people.
It is the philosophy of the West that they are advancing, and it is the values of the West that they are seeking. They are asking for democracy. They're asking for freedom of assembly. They're asking for freedom of expression.
The reopening of television links between China and the outside world is seen here as a further indication that hardliners in China's government are losing control to the more moderate elements. U.S. officials believe China's paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, has realized that brutality toward the demonstrators would virtually end China's relations with the West. It is that realization, they say, that has so far prevented a military push. People here say as long as there's no violence, it's best for the U.S. to stay on the sidelines and encourage the democratic wave that seems to be sweeping the People's Republic. John Holloman, CNN at the White House.
Young and old people of Chinese descent joined together in New York today to show their support for the protesters in Beijing. Several hundred elderly demonstrators gathered in front of the Chinese consulate. They were joined by Chinese students who are studying at universities in the New York area. The demonstrators say they oppose corruption and incompetence in the Chinese government and attempts to suppress.
Truck Center, Rosen Novak Ford.
In an early morning rally, they intensified their attack against Premier Li Peng, calling him China's Hitler. China's leadership, by all indications, is in the midst of an enormous power struggle. CNN's Mike Shinoy reports.
China entered the fifth day of martial law, with the people of Beijing continuing to defy the government and continuing stalemate in the bitter power struggle now rocking the Chinese leadership. In Tiananmen Square, student leaders announced a major reorganization of their movement, trying to create a more formal and structured apparatus to carry on a long-term struggle for democracy. As they did so, there were some new signs of opposition within the government and armed forces to the declaration of martial law announced last week by hardline Premier Li Peng. The official media highlighted reports Wednesday that the military units deployed around the capital had withdrawn to a nearby encampment. The press also reported for the first time that protesters were openly attacking Premier Li. At the same time, China's foreign minister told European diplomats that Liberal Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang was still in office. There had been reports he was forced to resign last week. Attention is now being focused on the imminent return to China of Wan Li, head of the country's parliament. He cut short an American tour late Tuesday to fly back home. There's speculation that Wan, who's a relative moderate, may try to play a mediating role between the rival factions in the leadership. And some analysts believe he may try to convene an emergency session of the Chinese parliament in the hope of formally ousting Premier Li Peng and thus bringing the crisis here to an end. Mike Shinoy, CNN, Beijing.
The leader of the Chinese People's Congress conferred with President Bush in Washington.
Now prepare some medicine for the students who get sick. And now we're trying our best to clear up the luggage. Some students who went on hunger strike a few days ago are feeling very weak these days. And it's very dangerous for them to catch epidemics. The students who are from other places are waiting for the train to go back home. And now the train is getting really busy. A lot of businessmen who are from other places cannot go back to their homes. And this grocery store is still keeping normal business. And the troops who are about to carry on the task of martial law began to withdraw yesterday. China Red Cross Society had an announcement yesterday saying that according to the principle of humanism, that in order to protect the health of the students on Tiananmen Square and to protect the students against the epidemic that will happen at any time, and to protect the health of the Beijing citizens and keep a normal life here in the capital, that we have following demands. First, we should still keep the ambulance as we have now in Tiananmen Square. Second, Tiananmen Square is now very dirty, and we should organize people to clear out the garbage as soon as possible and to prevent the epidemic from breaking out.
We have been carrying, with translation, a portion of the China Central Television newscast, and we've been carrying that live. Tens of thousands of students are maintaining their 12-day-old occupation of Beijing's Tiananmen Square, and with more on that, we go back to Beijing, and live on the telephone now is CNN's Mike Shinoa. Mike?
Go back.
The students have been in Beijing now for, I think it's 11 days, and they show no inclination to leave. Earlier in the day, they announced the reorganization of their students' union. They're trying to create a more permanent structure for what they see as a possibly long-term political struggle. The general mood around the city, as you could see from that Chinese newscast, is fairly relaxed. People are, in fact, beginning to go back to a semblance of a normal life. There were no massive demonstrations today, with most of the troops that had been on the perimeter of the city now withdrawn. The barricades and roadblocks that were being set up every night have also disappeared. However, the information that we have, and I must stress it is sketchy, indicates that the political struggle in the highest levels of the Chinese leadership continues to be fought out as fiercely as ever. The factions, two factions, almost at war in a political sense here, one with conservative Premier Li Peng and elder statesman Deng Xiaoping, the other headed by Liberal Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang. The indications we are getting is that that battle may soon be reaching a climax. Chinese journalists with whom we spoke say that they're getting the impression within the next day or two there may be some kind of resolution. It's not clear yet whether it will be one in which Zhao Ziyang emerges on top and a conciliatory line is taken towards the students, or one in which Li Peng wins out and a harsh line, including possibly action by the security forces against the protesters, is implemented. The sense at the moment, for what it is worth from our Chinese sources, is that the hardliners seem again to be regaining the edge after a period in which the more moderate forces had the momentum. But this is all very murky, it's all very opaque behind closed doors, and we're simply waiting to see what the leadership comes up with when they conclude this mammoth session, which has been going on more or less nonstop since the end of the weekend.
Mike, what do you know of the return to China of the Chinese People's Congress Chairman Wan Li, who yesterday met with President Bush at the White House? There is some speculation among State Department sources that he might be returning to perhaps convene a meeting of the People's Congress and that might lead to stripping Li Peng of his premiership. Have you heard anything there?
What we know at the moment is that Wan Li is apparently not returning directly to Beijing, but is rather going to stop for a couple of days in Shanghai. Our guess is that he wants to go to Shanghai first to get a read on the political situation before he comes up to the capital where passions are burning so fiercely. The question of whether he will attempt to convene a session of the National People's Congress is being discussed. At this stage, though, it may be, I think, fair to characterize that more as a hope or even wishful thinking than anything grounded in concrete facts. Wan Li could play an important role, though, in resolving this situation. He is known as a moderate figure. He is respected in the leadership. As the head of the Chinese parliament, he does occupy a very important position in Chinese politics, and perhaps he may be able to play some kind of mediating role. But I think, frankly, at this stage of the game, it depends on the outcome of this bitter struggle for dominance within the Communist Party. If the moderates win, there is speculation Wan Li might be named premier if Li Peng is sacked. If the conservatives win, Wan Li's own political future could be in doubt. As I said before, at this stage, we can only wait and speculate.
Okay, Mike, thanks. We'll be back to you throughout the day. CNN's Mike Shinoy reporting live from Beijing.
And it is coming up on 9 minutes after the hour.
Time we took a look at the weather.
Shinoy is now on the phone with the latest from Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Mike?
Cheryl, the indications are increasingly that hardliners in the Chinese leadership may be gaining the upper hand, and their argument for a crackdown on the students in Tiananmen Square may eventually win out. In addition to that report of an attack on the students made by the military brass and broadcast on Radio Beijing, there are several other signs at this hour that the hardliners are gaining the upper hand. One of them was the decision several hours ago to order a halt to all satellite news transmissions from Beijing. There are also reports, which I have not been able to confirm, but reports that a committee has been set up by the Communist Party to handle propaganda, and that Chinese newspaper editors and other journalistic heavyweights are being called in or will be called in. And given what the new party line on this situation is, we'll be watching to see how the Chinese media changes its coverage over the next 12 to 24 hours to see whether that turns out to be the case. In addition, sources continue to say to CNN that Deng Xiaoping, the elder statesman, and hardline Premier Li Peng now do have the situation in the leadership under control, and that the signs are that Liberal Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang is losing out in this power struggle. I must stress that at the moment there's no way to confirm any of these reports, but certainly our perception now is that after 5-6 days now of martial law in which the government has been unable to impose its will on the students or on the citizens of Beijing, the signs, reading the tea leaves here, are that the hardliners may soon be in a position to attempt to impose their will and to bring this crisis to an end on their terms. Cheryl?
Mike, one quick question before